Steve Snyder has been working on locomotives since 1996. 26 years on the railroad, through recessions, through a pandemic, through everything this industry could throw at him. And in all those years, he says, it has never been as bad as it is right now. He told a news crew in Washington State, and I'm going to quote him directly here, "We're redlined, and it's not that we're just reaching redlined, we're past it. That's why people are walking away." Walking away from railroad jobs, the same jobs that used to be the golden ticket for working class America. Good wages, solid pension, union protection, the kind of career your father told you to get and hold on to for dear life. And now, people are quitting faster than the railroads can hire replacements. And the replacements they do manage to bring in are walking out before they even finish training. Because the moment these new recruits find out what the job actually looks like in 2024, they want nothing to do with it. So what happened? How did one of the most stable blue-collar careers in American history turn into something people are fleeing from? The answer is complicated, but it really comes down to one man, one idea, and what happens when Wall Street gets its hands on an industry that used to be run by people who actually understood trains. The man's name was Hunter Harrison. He started in the railroad industry back in 1963, working his way up from the bottom, oiling axle boxes at a freight yard in Memphis. By 1993, he was running Illinois Central, and that's when he came up with something called precision scheduled railroading. La PSR for short. The basic concept sounds reasonable enough on paper. Instead of running trains whenever there's enough freight to fill them, you run trains on fixed schedules like a bus route. You move individual cars instead of waiting to assemble massive consists. In theory, this makes the network more efficient and more predictable. But here's what PSR actually became in practice. The railroads figured out that if you run fewer trains, you need fewer crews. If you run longer trains, you need fewer locomotives. If you close down classification yards and maintenance facilities, you save money on all that overhead, and Wall Street absolutely loved it. Every time a railroad announced it was implementing PSR, the stock price jumped. Every time they announced layoffs, investors cheered. Hunter Harrison himself got paid $84 million up front when he was brought in to implement PSR at CSX in 2017. He passed away later that year, but the monster he created kept growing. Between 2015 and 2022, the Class I freight railroads in America eliminated roughly 45,000 jobs. That's a 30% reduction in the workforce, and they did this while traffic volumes stayed relatively stable. So the same amount of freight was moving across the country, but now 70% of the workforce was expected to do 100% of the work. A union representative named Tim Gillum, a 31-year veteran of the industry, put it this way: "It was already hard enough to try to have a life. Now you have to cover for those other 30%. And covering for those other 30% means being available all the time. Not most of the time, all the time. Railroad operating crews work what's called the extra board, which means you're essentially on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. When your name comes up on the list in dispatch calls, you have 90 minutes to get to work. It doesn't matter if it's 3 in the morning. It doesn't matter if it's Christmas. It doesn't matter if your kid has a birthday party or your wife has a doctor's appointment. When they call, you go." Senator Bernie Sanders stood up on the floor of the United States Senate and described what these workers actually deal with. He said railroad workers are on call for up to 14 consecutive days, 12 hours a day. Shifts can last nearly 80 hours a week, and for most of railroad history, these workers had 0 paid sick days. 0. If you woke up with the flu, if your back went out, if you needed to see a doctor for any reason, you had to either give up one of your precious few personal days that you'd scheduled months in advance, or you had to go to work sick. There was no calling in the morning of your shift and saying you couldn't make it. That's not how it works on the railroad. BNSF, one of the largest freight railroads in North America, made things even worse in February 2022 when they implemented something called the high-vis attendance policy. Here's how it works. Every employee starts with 30 points. If you miss a call or take an unplanned day off, even for a family emergency, you lose points. If it falls on a weekend or a high-impact day like a holiday, you lose extra points. Run out of points and you're fired. The only way to earn points back is to work 14 days in a row without missing anything. 14 days straight. And remember, these are 12-hour shifts where you don't know when you're going to work until dispatch calls you. Steve Snyder, the same guy I mentioned at the beginning, described what this does to a person. We can't spend time with our families. We can't even get a medical checkup because we don't know when we are going to work, because we're on call 365 days a year, 7 days a week, unless we spend one of those precious 30 points per career. Now you might be thinking, well, these railroad companies must be struggling financially if they're pushing their workers this hard. They must be trying to survive in a tough market. Except that's not the case at all. The major freight railroads are among the most profitable companies in America. Senator Sanders pointed out that the 4 largest carriers were spending over $18 billion a year on stock buybacks and dividends to shareholders. $18 billion. And they were telling their workers they couldn't afford to give them paid sick days. In late 2022, railroad workers had finally had enough. Multiple unions were preparing to strike. The contracts had been under negotiation for years, and the workers were demanding something that most Americans take for granted: the ability to stay home when you're sick without losing your job. The railroads refused. The unions voted to reject the proposed contracts. A nationwide rail strike looked inevitable, and then Congress stepped in. Under the Railway Labor Act, Congress has the power to block railroad strikes if they determine that a work stoppage would cause too much economic damage. And that's exactly what they did. In December 2022, with bipartisan support, Congress voted to impose a contract on the railroad workers. The contract included pay raises, but it did not include paid sick days. The workers had voted no. The workers had said this contract was unacceptable, and Congress forced them to accept it anyway. A worker named Matthew Weaver, a railroad carpenter in Toledo, Ohio, said after the vote, "Here is America's essential workers, rail workers. We have no paid sick days." It's disgusting. The Hill newspaper reported that railroad workers could leave the industry in droves after Congress forced through the deal, and that's exactly what happened. People who had been holding out hope for a fair contract looked at what just happened and started updating their resumes. Younger workers who cared about work-life balance, who weren't willing to sacrifice their health and their families for a job that treated them like machines, they started heading for the exits. And here's the thing about railroad workers: these aren't jobs you can fill with anyone off the street. It takes years to train a locomotive engineer. It takes months just to train a conductor. When experienced workers leave, they take decades of knowledge with them. Knowledge about specific routes, about how to handle equipment in bad weather, about what to do when something goes wrong at 2 a.m. on a mountain grade. You can't download that from a training manual. A comment on one of the industry news sites from someone who identified as a longtime railroader summed it up. You often hear about job applicants that can't pass drug screens. The few that show up for training quit before they even mark up when they find out what they are in for. These were coveted jobs in the 70s when railroads were run by career railroaders. Now the goal is to have one dead-tired person on that 14,000-ton train with overlaid tech like inward-facing cameras. Unfortunately, the real world doesn't always cooperate with the algorithm. In February 2024, the Federal Railroad Administration sent a letter to Union Pacific's CEO expressing serious concerns about the railroad's decision to furlough maintenance workers. Administrator Amit Bose wrote, and again, I'm quoting directly, "The safety of railroad operations is paramount, and any decisions that compromise this fundamental principle are unacceptable. Furloughing maintenance of equipment workers puts a strain on workers across the railroad, leading to fatigue and potential errors that could have severe ramifications for both workers and the public. The federal government is telling the railroad that what they're doing is dangerous, and the railroad keeps doing it anyway, because the stock price goes up every time they cut costs, because Wall Street rewards short-term profits over long-term sustainability. Because the people making these decisions will be retired with their millions before the consequences fully arrive. Meanwhile, the workers who remain are stretched to the breaking point. The president of the Smart Transportation Division, Jeremy Ferguson, wrote to federal regulators that the freight rail network is at a breaking point and cannot sustain any more reductions. He said morale has dropped to an all-time low, and employees are leaving in unprecedented numbers. Some progress has been made since the 2022 debacle. CSX, under a new CEO who actually came up through the railroad industry instead of business school, started offering paid sick days to some of its workers in early 2023. Other railroads have followed reluctantly under pressure from unions and public opinion. But the fundamental problem remains. The industry cut 30% of its workforce to please Wall Street, demanded that the remaining workers be available every hour of every day, and is now surprised that people don't want to work there anymore. A railroad worker named Devin Mance said at a union town hall in 2022, "So many people are quitting, and the ones that stick around are disgruntled and take little pride anymore in their work, and that's not who we are as railroaders, so we're all demoralized and pushed to where we just don't care anymore." That last part should worry everyone. These are the people moving hazardous materials through your town. These are the people responsible for making sure trains stop at crossings and don't derail on curves. And they're telling us publicly, on the record, that they've been pushed to the point where they just don't care anymore. The railroads are still hiring. They're actually hiring continuously now, trying to create a more balanced workforce because so many experienced people are leaving. But for every 5 baby boomers who retire, only 2 younger workers are entering the trades. And the ones who do come in, when they see the schedule, when they see the attendance policy, when they realize they're going to be on call every single day for the foreseeable future, with no way to plan a life outside of work, a lot of them walk right back out. That's where it stands right now. The most profitable freight rail system in the world, run by some of the richest corporations in America, unable to keep enough workers on the payroll because they treated the people who actually moved the freight like they were disposable. Hunter Harrison is gone, but his legacy keeps rolling down the tracks. And every time you see a headline about a train that was too long, or a derailment that happened because something wasn't maintained properly, or a crew that was too exhausted to notice a warning sign, remember that none of this was an accident. Someone decided it would be good for the stock price.